Okay, so we were looking at the Eightfold Path as the Buddha presents it, to achieve enlightenment. And the interesting thing is you would think that Buddhism would be all about, would be just about this idea of enlightenment. But it also really emphasizes taking care of people, because being a good person and having a positive effect on others seems to help you move further towards enlightenment. So that's good. So it's there's a lot of common sense in Buddhism as well, teaching about values of compassion and care and things like that. In addition to that, it even takes it a step further. For instance, Buddhism is one of the many traditions in Hinduism that practice vegetarianism. So someone who is a strict Buddhist will be a vegetarian. It might be more for the monks than for the average people who just support the monks, but it can vary a lot. The different ways, the different methods are all things along this line, or they're things about the mind. The Buddhists are basically the first psychologists, because they really do try to study how does the mind work, because they're interested in understanding the mind so that one can move more towards this mental state called enlightenment and free one from suffering. So they have a very big vocabulary for different parts of the mind and things like that. And it's interesting the difference between meditation as we do it here these days and meditation as is practiced in ancient times and more traditionally. We tend to focus on meditation as like a day-to-day thing. It'll help improve your mood. It'll help you break free from the things you're experiencing that you're suffering from in your day-to-day life. It'll help sort of clarify everything. But in Buddhist tradition, that's only sort of a secondary thing. The real goal is to completely free yourself from all these forms of suffering, to just break into this better state of mind where you will be great all the time. And not everybody can do that. So it's understood that only some people will do that. And these tend to be Buddhist monks. And then the lay people will support them. The people who aren't the monks will support them with donations, sometimes food donations, things like that. So there's this relationship between the monks and the community. But the monks are the ones who are really meditating hard. They're meditating up a storm to get to enlightenment. So to clarify some of the vocabulary here, enlightenment, which is our translation for the word bodhi, is basically the state of knowing the way the world is, and being at peace because you know the way the world is. Whereas nirvana is kind of the state of bliss that you're in when you know that truth. So nirvana comes from a word meaning sort of blown out, like a candle blown out, or like quenched your thirst. So this is a state where you are completely free from all your attachments, and so therefore you don't experience dissatisfaction or suffering. And interestingly, whereas Hindu tradition believes in reincarnation, Buddhism also believes in reincarnation but thinks it's a bad thing. So Hinduism, remember we said that your different lifetimes you'll have karma. You'll go to better lifetimes if you've been a good person, and you'll go to worse lifetimes if you've been a bad person. So you just go all around through this entire cycle. Well, the Buddhist goal is actually to escape that. They call it the cycle of suffering. And nirvana is not just a state of being free from suffering, but it's a state of being free from this sort of endless cycle of rebirth. And Buddhists are not super clear as to what that means in practical terms. Like, is it equivalent to heaven in any way? Not quite. But if you are in the state of nirvana, you will be free, and you won't have to be subject to that chain of rebirth over and over again. Because it seems like Buddhists got tired of that idea, or they thought that would get very tiring, going through all those reincarnations. So nirvana is contrasted with samsara, which means wandering. And so samsara is the normal state that people are in, where we are endlessly being reborn because of our attachment to things, our good and our evil and our suffering. So we're trapped in that cycle of suffering, and enlightenment can let us out to nirvana. And then dharma is a big concept for Buddhists, just as it is for Hindus. But instead of it meaning duty to your caste, it means duty to Buddhism, kind of. The duties of Buddhists to take care of the world, because this is a message that can free everybody from suffering. So your goal is to spread that far and wide, and the goals of Buddhists are to take care of everybody and free everybody from suffering, basically. Okay. Another weird idea that Hinduism contrasts with Buddhism is you remember how I said Hindu had all the sort of individual selves are all part of Brahman? Buddhism rejects the idea of the self. It says that we aren't really separate in any way, basically. Hinduism like to say we all have our individual Atmans. Buddhism just does away with that concept of the self, our word for Atman, entirely. It says what you think of yourself as yourself is just sort of current conditions and current circumstances, and there's not something that is going to last forever. And it may seem weird to say this when you keep getting reincarnated, but Buddhists tend to think of this as just a form of energy that just keeps bouncing back and forth and changing forms. And the real goal is to be free from all that. And it raises some weird questions like, are you going to be free? Will you still be you? Buddhists would say, oh, well, there isn't any you anyway. It's all just an illusion. So your real goal is to get to nirvana. And then you will be freed from all the illusions, including the illusion of being separate and being an individual, which is interesting. And it's not super clear all the time how much nirvana is like Brahman. Because in Brahman, everybody's one. You could imagine that sort of dissolving your individual self. Sometimes it seems to be the same thing when you talk about nirvana, and then sometimes it's like nirvana is not even that. It's something else. But Buddhists just basically feel like we're a bunch of sort of billiard balls bouncing around. This is what they call dependent origination. Everything is just stuff that happens. So we don't really have like one self. We're just energy going through different changes. It's pretty wild, and gives you a lot to think about. Okay, so the Buddha didn't really talk about nirvana because he thought that was kind of the wrong question. And he didn't really want to talk about whether there was an afterlife, and he didn't want to talk about whether he would exist in the afterlife because he thought that was kind of a distracting question. So he wouldn't explain whether the world was infinite. He wouldn't explain whether the self is just the body or if it's something else. If it really exists, he wouldn't really fully go into that. And he wouldn't explain whether the Buddha exists after death. The Buddha said, no, I'm not going to answer any of those questions. He basically thought it was the wrong set of priorities. He said, this is like somebody who's been shot with an arrow and is bleeding out, asking, the doctor comes along and the doctor asks, okay, well, who is the guy who shot the arrow and what kind of wood does he use and who made the arrow? No, that's the wrong question. The question is, how do we get the arrow out of this guy? So the Buddha basically felt like everybody has an arrow inside them, and why are we wasting our time with talking about the afterlife when we could talk about how to get this arrow out of us? Okay, so these teachings become popular, and they form what's known as the Pali Canon. So, like a lot of other authors, the Buddha didn't write anything down himself. Stuff was written down by his followers, but at least there's supposed to be records of sermons that he gave, speeches that he gave to his followers. This was the first few centuries of Buddhism, while Buddhism was remaining kind of localized to northeastern India. And these are written in the language the Buddha spoke, which is not Sanskrit, but a language called Pali. So it's called the Pali Canon. A canon meaning sort of like a collection of holy texts. But unlike the Christian canon, which has already been kind of decided, what's in the Bible, what's not, the Pali Canon, what's in it changes on who you ask. But these are the earliest Buddhist scriptures and the ones that seem to be most closely connected to the Buddha. And the individual sermons are known as sutras, which means threads. So different threads of Buddhist thought, I guess you could say. So these sutras become quite popular and the message spreads. Now, the funny thing is that Buddhism started in India, but it kind of dies out in India. For a while it spreads through India, but then it dwindles away. And it only really remains in that northeastern corner where the Buddha was. But when it spreads to China and Japan and Sri Lanka and Korea and places like that, it stays popular there, and it continues to be popular today. Is a pretty big deal. And so the Buddha kind of becomes a big deal in other countries than in his home country. And maybe you could say that about other religions as well. Maybe there's something to be said for Christianity like that. But Buddhism spreads along the Silk Roads, the roads, basically the trade routes of China and India. There are pathways going along there, and people don't necessarily travel the whole pathway, but they travel a little way, and then someone else takes something a little way further. So it's pretty impressive that things can go the whole way. And one of the things that went that whole way was the Buddhist religion. And this is happening through like the 100s to the 900s. So kind of the Roman Empire is dying during the early part of this. And China is going through some more stuff, which we'll talk about later on. Okay, now a good time to get into the different schools of Buddhism. There's basically this big division between two different kinds of Buddhism, and I'll try and make it clear what the difference is. So we have the Theravada school, which could be translated as the traditionalist school. And that's the one that's popular in India and certain parts of the world like Sri Lanka and Vietnam. And then we have the Mahayana school, which basically means big ferry boat, the big boat school of Buddhism. And that's popular in China, Japan, and Indonesia. Okay, so what's the difference between these two? Basically, the Theravada, there's a lot of things. The Theravada has a tendency to see the Buddha more as a hero or a teacher than a god. Not always, but more of a tendency to see him as a human being rather than a god. In Mahayana, he's definitely way more of a god. But the big difference is that in Theravada Buddhism, enlightenment is for the people who seek it out, more or less. People will find out about Buddhism, and if they want to become enlightened, they'll become enlightened. But in Mahayana, everybody in the universe, everybody in the whole gosh darn universe is going to become enlightened. And Buddhists are going to help everybody get there. And the Buddha is going to help everybody get there. And so the Buddha is a kind of God who's going to save everybody from the problems of suffering, and he's going to get everybody there. The idea of the big ferry boat idea is basically that they want everybody to get on that boat. It's big enough for everybody. And they have a sort of nickname, a negative nickname for the Theravada people, and they call them Hinayana, which means the little ferry boat. So that's a little boat. Only a few people get on there. And the Mahayana say, that doesn't make any sense. We want everybody to get on that boat. But don't call the Theravada the Hinayana. That's kind of a jerk thing to say. It's like insulting them. But the Mahayana think of themselves as a bigger boat. And one of the ways this works out is that the Mahayana school believes in what are called bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are beings, people who have achieved enlightenment, but they keep coming back, not because they're stuck in the cycle of suffering, but because they want to help others achieve enlightenment. That's their duty. That's their goal, is to help everybody. So these bodhisattvas are, these immortal beings. They exist in that weird state of nirvana, which is hard to kind of understand. And they can come back. They can reincarnate if they want to, or if they can just come into the world temporarily. And if you're in trouble, you can call on them and they'll help you out. So you can kind of pray to them, basically. You can ask for their help in the problems in your life. You can ask them to save you from evil, from the bad guys. You can call on these bodhisattvas and they'll take care of you. And so the bodhisattvas, they're kind of like saints, but they're also kind of like gods, in the same way that when Christianity spread, saints kind of take over the roles that local gods played in Europe among the pagans. We think bodhisattvas take over some of the roles that local gods played in China and Japan and even India to some extent, Tibet. All of these sort of gods become bodhisattvas. And so that's a different thing. And Mahayana is cosmic. They believe in, hundreds and hundreds of different planets, where different thousands, millions of planets, and a universe that goes on for a really long time. And different bodhisattvas will just keep coming back until every single one of the living beings achieves enlightenment. Whereas the Theravada, they're like kind of, just do it yourself. And it's more pragmatic. Okay, so we're running out of time in this part, but we'll talk some more in a second about Buddhist art.